Hey, what's going on, guys? So today we're going to build a full Next.js React application with a database and authentication. And I reached out to two of my favorite products to see if they wanted to collaborate on this project. So this video is sponsored by Neon and Clerk. Neon is a cloud database and Postgres serverless platform that I've recently used in a few projects, and it's extremely powerful, easy to use, and affordable with a very generous free tier. And it offers branching and some other cool features that I'll talk about later. And then Clerk is an authentication and user management system that's incredibly easy to use, and you can have your users authenticate with just about any service, including Google, Facebook, GitHub, as well as just email and password. And Clerk also has a very generous free tier with up to 10,000 users monthly. So there's no paying for anything or adding credit card info to follow along with this project. Now, as far as what we'll be building, some of you may be familiar with the expense tracker application from my 20 vanilla projects course. We also redid it with React and Vue.js. Now we're going to take that app and enhance it to use Neon as our database to store users and transactions. We'll also be using Prisma for migrations and interacting with the database. And then we'll add full authentication and access control with Clerk. So users can log in with email and password as well as their Google account. And all users will be saved in the Neon database and will only be able to access their own transactions. All right, so we're also going to be using React's new server actions. So there's no API routes. We can just create a function in an actions file and do all of our Prisma database stuff from there. So it's a relatively in-depth project for YouTube, and I think you're going to learn a lot, and you'll be able to start building your own stuff with this stack. And I'll have the final repo in the description along with links to Clerk and Neon, so check them out, and let's get started. All right, guys, so just a couple things I wanna go over, a couple websites, and I'll have the links to all these in the description. So, of course, we have nextjs.org. That's where you can find all the documentation for Next. We'll be using things like server actions, so you might want to just use that as kind of a supplement. And then I have the final repo here, expense tracker Next.js. So this link will also be in the description, and if you need any code snippets, we're going to grab the CSS from here. We're just using a global CSS file, so we don't really have to worry about styling and stuff. But yeah, so that's the repo. And then Clerk.com is what we're going to be using for authentication and user management. So you will need to create an account. There's a very generous free tier. As you can see, you get up to 10,000 monthly active users. So very generous free tier. You don't have to add credit card or anything like that. And you'll have your dashboard with all your users. So we'll be using that along with Neon for our database, which is a Postgres serverless platform, very easy to get set up. So pretty early on in the course, we're going to set up our database and connect to it. And then Prisma is the ORM we'll be using for migrations, for just interacting, making queries and stuff like that. So let's go ahead and just go into our terminal and just navigate to wherever you want to create this. And we're going to run npx create next app at latest, and then I'm going to call it expense-tracker-next.js. And I'm going to say yes to TypeScript. If you don't want to use it, that's okay too. I'm going to say no to ESLint, no to Tailwind because we're just using a global style sheet. Source directory, no. App router, yes. And then customize the alias, no. All right, so now it's just going to set up all of our dependencies. And now what I'm going to do is just cd into that directory and then just open up VS Code. Of course, if you want to use a different editor, you can. All right, so from now on, I'm going to use my integrated terminal. So I'll just close this one up. And I'm just going to run the dev server. So let's say npm run dev. So that'll open on 3000. Let's open that up. Takes a second the first time you load it. And there we go. So now we have our just basic landing page. So let's just do a little bit of cleanup. So in the app folder, I'm going to get rid of the page module CSS. We don't need that. And in the page.tsx, which is the home page, I'm going to just delete everything and just create a brand new component. Now I'm using a specific extension called Simple React Snippets. And with this, we can just do SFC, I believe is what I use. Yeah, stateless function component, and it's an arrow function. So let's do SFC, enter, and then we can give it a name. This is the home page, so that's what I'll call it. Then we can tab into the props. We have no props for this, so we'll tab again into the return, and let's put a main tag, and in that I'll just have an H1, and we'll say expense tracker. And there we go. All right, so the global CSS, I want to change this. So I'm going to grab the global CSS from the repository. The link's in the description. Just go into the app folder and then global CSS. And let's just grab that and replace this with what we just copied. Save that. And there we go. All right. So the next thing I want to do is open up the layout.tsx, and a couple things. I want to use the Roboto font, so I'm going to bring that in. I'm going to select these 3 instances of enter with Command or Control D, so twice, and then just change it to Roboto. Now, see how it preserved the case? This stayed uppercase, this was lowercase, this is uppercase R. That's because of an extension that I have that I would definitely recommend to everyone. It's called, what is it? Right here, multiple cursor case preserve. So if you're selecting multiple instances and you're changing whatever that is, it'll preserve the case, as the title says. So it's really a really simple extension, but probably one of the most helpful that I have installed. So I would definitely recommend that. Now we're getting an error here, a TypeScript error, because this takes in a wait. So the wait isn't optional. So I'm just going to add on to this. So we got our subsets, and let's go right before that, and let's say wait like that. And for the wait, I'm going to do 400. Okay, so that should clear up that error. Enter is not defined. That's because down here, we now want to change that to Roboto. And there we go. All right, and then we might as well change this up, the title here. So I'll change that to expense tracker. And for the description, what do I want to say for this? We'll just say track your expenses and create a budget. Create a budget. All right. So that's that. We can exit this file for now. So now everything's pretty simplified. We just have this one, our home page, which obviously is the root URL. So I think that before we do anything else, why don't we create our Neon database? So I'm going to go to neon.tech, and you're just going to want to log in. And I'm going to use GitHub. So just say continue with GitHub. And then you're going to want to create a project. So we'll say new project. I'm going to call it expense tracker and just leave the defaults. Click create project. And that's really the minimum that you have to do to get set up. You can see down here we have our connection string and different platforms. So for instance, we'll be using Prisma. So in our Prisma schema, we're just going to add a new data source for Postgres and include our database URL. Now, there's a concept of branching with Neon, which is really cool. It allows you to manage your database branches like you'd manage your code branches. And by default, we get this main branch, which is automatically created for us. And branches are great for development, testing, and various other purposes. And they improve your productivity and optimize your continuous integration and delivery pipelines. So a branch is a copy on write clone of your data, and you can create a branch from a current or past state. For example, you can create a branch that includes all the data up to the current time or up to an earlier time. And a branch is isolated from its originating data, so you can play around with it, you can modify it, and then delete it when it's no longer needed. Now, if you want to create a dev branch, for example, you can just click this button right here and it will create it for you. But since this is such a simple application, I'm going to just stick with the main branch. And if you were to go to branches up here on the left, you'll see a list of them. We just have the main branch, so I'm going to click on that. And by default, if we go to roles and databases, we have a role of NeonDB owner and a database of NeonDB. So what I'm going to do is create a new role, and I'm just going to call it Brad, but you can call it whatever, and we'll create the role. You can copy the password or download the .env. We don't need to do that right now, so I'm just going to close out. So now we have this role of Brad, and then under databases, I'm going to create a new database, and I'm going to call this, we'll call it expense underscore tracker. And for the owner, I'm going to select that Brad role and then create. Okay, so now we have a new role and a new database. And if we go to dashboard and we want to get the connection string for that, we can choose expense tracker and choose Brad for the role. And we can just click show password as well. And here's our connection string. So I'm going to copy that, and then let's create a .env for our environment variables. And let's say database underscore URL, and then we're going to paste that in. All right, so we have our database URL. Now, a couple other things I want to show you. We're going to be using Prisma migrations to actually create our tables and stuff, but you can do it from within the dashboard here. So if we go to SQL Editor and we go up to right here, I want to select the expense tracker database, and we'll just get rid of this. So since we're using Postgres, right, Neon uses Postgres, so we can write SQL here. So let's just experiment and create a table. So I'm going to say create table transactions. And you don't have to do this because I'm just going to drop it afterwards. I just want to show you how this works. So create a table of transactions, and let's say we want an ID field. We want it to be serial primary key. Okay, so that should just auto increment be our primary key, and then we'll have a text field called text, which will be the type of text. I like to make that uppercase. And then the amount will be, say, varchar 11, and then created underscore at, that would be a timestamp, and we can make that have a default of the current underscore timestamp. All right, so let's see if we can run this. So I'll click run, and you see over here we have it in the history, and if we go down to tables and we select the database expense tracker, you can see we have our ID text amount and created at. And from here you can add a record, so you can add it that way, or we can just go to the SQL editor, make sure that you have the expense tracker chosen, and then let's do insert into transactions, and we want to insert the text field and the amount. Okay, and then we'll say values, and I'm just gonna go on to the next line here, and we'll do a couple different things. So let's say paycheck, so that's the text, and then for the amount we'll say 500, and then we'll put a comma here, and let's add another one. So I want to add an expense, let's say gas, and the way this is going to work is if it's an expense, then it's going to be a negative number, so we'll say -50, right? And then let's say we have dinner, so we buy dinner, and that's $100, so that would be -100. All right, so let's go ahead and run that. And if we go now to tables, we should see, if you choose the expense tracker database, we see all three transactions, the auto increment ID, the text amount, and the created at. Now, I'm not going to keep this table, so let's go back into the editor and choose expense tracker, and I'm just going to drop the table. So let's say drop table transactions, and let's run that, and now we got rid of that because we're going to recreate it through our app through Prisma migrations. So now let's jump back into our application. We can go ahead and make that smaller, and I'm going to install Prisma. So let's open up a new terminal because that one's running the dev server, and we'll say npm install -d Prisma. And then once we do that, we want to initialize a schema. Okay, so it's installed. Now we can run npx Prisma and init. Okay, so by doing that, it should create this Prisma folder, and inside of it we have a schema.prisma. Just make that a little smaller. All right, so we have our data source DB Postgres. We're looking at a environment variable called database URL, which we have right here. That's our Neon database. So that's all set up. Now what we want to do is create our model. So let's go down here, and basically we're going to have two models, one for users and one for transactions. And these models are going to be used with our migrations to create the actual database tables. So we want to create all of our fields here. So let's say model user, and the first field we'll have is an ID, which will be of the type string. I want it to be the primary key, so we do that with @ID, and then I want a default value of a UUID, so we can do that by passing in the UUID function. Okay, and UUID stands for, I forget what it is. It's a universal something identifier, I forget. But yeah, so that's going to be the regular ID. Now, in addition to that, since we're using Clerk, the user is going to be created within Clerk, and it'll have its own ID there as well. So I want to store that in the database too. So let's call that Clerk user ID. Okay, now you can have Clerk authentication without doing this, without having the user stored in your own database, but we want that user information in our database. We want the user's email, name, and stuff like that. So that's going to be a string as well, and I'm also going to just add @unique, because obviously we don't want two users with the same Clerk user ID. Then we're going to have the email, so that's going to be a string, and that's also going to be unique. Then we'll have the name, and say string. Now name I'm going to say optional, so we'll add a question mark there, and then image URL, because when you use Clerk you can have an image. So string, oops, that should be uppercase. Okay, so name, image URL, let's do created at, and that will be the type of date time, and let's add a default. So we'll say default, and then we'll pass in now. And let's do updated at. That will also be a date time, and we'll say at updated at. And then we're going to have a relationship between models and transactions, because when you log in, you only want to see your transactions, so we have to be linked. So we're going to say transaction or transactions, and we're going to set that to the type of transaction, and it's going to be an array. So we want our brackets, and right now it's going to have a red line because transaction doesn't exist. So let's do that next. We'll create the transaction model. So model transaction, and then here we want again an ID. It's going to be a string, it's going to be primary key, and we want a default of a UUID, and then we're going to have text. So text will be string. Let's do amount, and amount will store as float. What else? And then for the relation to the user, let's say relation to user, we're going to have the user ID for that transaction, which is going to be string. And then we're going to have a user field, and this is where we want to create our relation. So we're going to say user, and then user with uppercase, and then @relation, and then our fields. So we pass in here fields, and in brackets user ID, and then we want references, and the reference we want to use is Clerk user ID. And then we can set on delete, because if you delete a user, then you're going to have transactions that belong to a user that doesn't exist. So we want to make sure that we cascade the deletes, so that if you do delete a user, then all of their transactions also get deleted. All right, and then after that, we're going to just have a created at, and that's going to be date time. and we'll do a default of now, and then we're going to add an index for the user ID. So we do double @ and then index and then user ID. All right, so that should do it as far as our model. And when we run our migration, it should create the tables for us. So we don't have to manually create them like we used to have to do back in the day with SQL databases. Okay, so let's, so we modified the schema. Now we want to generate the client. So we can do that. Let's jump into our terminal here. And we're going to run npx Prisma, close that up, Prisma generate. So whenever if you modify this, if you add or change something, you want to run this npx Prisma generate. So Prisma schema loaded. Okay, now we want to create our migration and run the migration. So we can do npx and then Prisma migrate dev. And that should create the tables in Neon. Okay, enter a name for the migration. Let's just say user transaction create. Now it says your database is now in sync with your schema. Now before we look at the database, you'll see that a migrations folder was created. And if we look at this file right here, this is what was run. Create table user, and it has all the fields that we have in our model, and then create table transaction, all the fields there, any indexes, any foreign keys, so any relationships between the users and the transactions. So that should have been run. Now let's check Neon. So let's go to tables, and if we choose our expense tracker database, there we go. We have our migrations, and then we have this transaction, which has the fields that we have in our model, including the user ID, and then the user has all the fields that we have for our user model. So our database is now set up and ready to use. So the other thing I want to do before we move on to set up Clerk and set up authentication and all that is create a file that we can use to interact with our database, a file that will initialize the Prisma client. So we're going to put that in the root. We're going to have a folder called lib, L-I-B. And then in that, we're going to have a file called db.ts. Okay, so here we can import the Prisma client, okay, and that's going to be from, not that, it's just Prisma, @Prisma/client, okay, and then I'm going to declare I'm going to say declare global and var Prisma client or undefined. So what I'm going to do here is kind of like a hack, because Next.js has hot reloading, and we don't want to initialize the Prisma client over and over. So we have to kind of add this little hack here. So we're going to say export const db, because we want this db variable to be exported, because that's what we're going to bring into our other files where we want to use the database, and we're going to set that to, let's say, global this dot Prisma or new Prisma client. Okay, and then we're just going to check to see if we're not in production, because in production we just want to initialize it normally, but if we're not in production, then we want to make sure that we don't initialize it multiple times with Next.js hot reloading. So let's say process.env.node.env, and we're going to check if it's not equal to production. And if not, then we're going to say global this.prisma and set that to our DB. Okay, so that's it. In this file, we don't have to touch at all, but we can now bring in this DB variable, and we can use it to make queries, whether we're adding something or updating, fetching, whatever it is we're doing. So that's our main database file. All right, so now I want to start to set up Clerk, our authentication. All right, I know we haven't really done anything in our app yet, but setting this stuff up first is going to make it easy for us to just create our components and do what we need to do. I always think that, well, I shouldn't say always, but in most cases, I think it's good to just get your database stuff set up, get your API keys and all that you need, get that set up before you start building components. So now let's install Clerk. So I'm going to go back to, let's go down here, clear that up, and let's say npm install, and it's going to be @Clerk/Next.js. That's the package we want to install. And then we're going to go to the Clerk dashboard. Okay, so we're going to sign in, and everything here I'm doing you can do absolutely free. So I'm going to sign in with GitHub, and I have this expense tracker dev. I don't want to use that. So you're going to want to create a new application. And over here is where, well, first off, let's give it a name. I'm just going to call it expense_tracker. And then you can choose these different methods of logging in. So I want the defaults, which are Google and email and password. But you can also use GitHub, Microsoft, Dropbox, all kinds of stuff here. But that's all we're going to need. So, and our login will look like this. So let's click Create Application. All right, now what we want to do is, let's see. So we already installed it. We already did this. And then we need to set our environment variables, which is going to be the public publishable key and the secret key. So I'm going to click the copied. I'm going to click the clipboard thingy here. And then let's go into our .env and paste that in. So obviously yours will be different. Don't use mine. Mine won't even exist by the time you watch this. But this should be your publishable key and secret key. So let's save that, close that up. And then it says update middleware TS. So update your middleware file or create one at the root of your project. And yeah, so we want to copy that and go into the root here. And we're going to create a file called middleware.ts and then just paste that in. So this will initialize the Clerk middleware. And then the next thing is to add the provider to our app. So we want that to go in the layout. So if we want to use Clerk, we have to wrap everything in the provider. So let's import that up here. Let's say import Clerk provider, and that's going to be from @Clerk/Next.js. And then we're going to put that in the return. We're going to wrap everything in that Clerk provider. Okay, so let's take this ending tag and let's put that down here, just like that. And we should be all set to use Clerk authentication. It's as easy as that to get set up. So now, why don't we create our header component, because that's where I want to have the login button. So let's see, do we even have a components folder yet? No, we don't. So let's create a folder called components and then a file called header.tsx. We'll say sfc. So we're going to create a component called header. And let's see, in the return, let's have a nav tag, and I'm going to give it a class of navbar. Now these classes are in the global CSS file that I've added, so we're not going to have to worry about writing any CSS. And then we're going to have another div in that called navbar-container. And this is, you're going to see just how easy this is to have a sign in button and sign out button. So, and some options for settings. So really cool stuff. So let's have just an H2 for our logo thing. So we'll just say expense tracker. And then we'll have a div. So this will be on the other side. And again, it's already styled. So basically I want to import a couple things from Clerk. So let's import, and this is going to be from, and then @Clerk/Next.js. So what I want to bring in is going to be the SignIn in button, and then signed in, which will check to see if we're signed in, and then signed out, and then user button. And the user button is basically the little avatar thing that you can click on to log out and see your settings and so on. All right, so now in this div, I'm going to use the signed out component. So we want signed out, and whatever I put in here is going to show if we're signed out, if we're not logged in. So what I want to show is the sign in button. All right. Then underneath that, let's say if the user is signed in, then let's show the user button. All right, so we'll save that, and let's go back to our thing here, and we have to obviously bring the header in. Now the header is going to come into the layout because obviously we want this on every page. So let's import the header from components @component/header. And then we're going to put this, let's see, we have body. Let's go into the body, and let's wrap this children. I'm going to have a main tag, and actually I want main and a class of container. Okay, and then we'll move this children into the main, and then above the main we'll have our header component. Okay, so there we go. So we have a sign in button, right? I'm going to click on that, and it's going to show us the sign in, and I'm going to log in with one of my Google accounts here. I'll use this tech guy info. Click continue. And that's it. We're now logged in, and you see the user button. If I click that, we have this drop down where we can sign out. We have this manage account where you can update your profile. You see your email address. You can add additional email addresses. You see your connected Google accounts. So that was like nothing to have this functionality. And to do this from scratch on your own would be a lot of work. So really cool stuff. So if I sign out, it just signs me out, and now I see my sign in button again. Now, the issue here is, well, not really an issue, but it's not saving our user to our database. It's Clerk is working, right? That's all set up, and you can add, checks if you want to show something if the user's logged in or whatever. But we want to save that user in the database, okay? And doing that is pretty simple, and there's a lot of different ways to do this. So initially, I was going to use something called webhooks to run a function when a user is created, because you can do that. And that takes some extra work because you need to make your app publicly accessible. So when we're working locally like we are right now, we would need to use something like ngrok. And this is initially what I was going to do, but I ran into some issues where I had to deal with opening ports on my router, and I don't want you guys to have to do that. I don't want to have a project that, a quarter of the way through, you can't continue because you have some firewall issue or whatever. So some things are just not great for tutorials, even if that's the more common way to do it. But what we're going to do is something very simple. We're just going to create a utility called checkUser, and it's going to get the current user, the logged in user, the Clerk user, and see if that user is already in the database. If it isn't, then it's just going to add that user to the database, okay? And it's just going to return the user. If it's already there, it'll just get it and return it. So let's put that in the lib folder. So I'm going to create a file here. We're going to call it checkuser.ts. All right, and there's a couple ways that we can do this with Clerk. So I'm going to import this current user from Clerk Next.js server. And then we're going to also import our database. Remember that db.ts file? That's where we're going to use that. Well, we're going to use it in a lot of different places, but we're going to use it right here. So let's say @/lib/ and then db. Okay, so that's our database file. And then we'll make this a function. We want to export it too. So let's say export const, and we'll call this checkUser. Okay, so we'll just make this an async arrow function. All right, and then let's get the user, so we can say const user and set that to await. So this is asynchronous, so that's why we're using a sync await here. And we want to get the current user. All right, then we want to check, let's say check for current logged in Clerk user. So we'll say if, and then if not user, then let's return null. Okay, so if there's no user, then we'll return null. Then we want to check if, and what I mean by that is it's checking Clerk, not checking our database. But we want to check if the user is already in the database. So we can do that by, let's say, const logged in user, and then we're going to await, and then this is where we use our DB file. So db.user. And then I'm going to use find unique. Okay, so these are methods that Prisma offers. So find unique is going to take in a where clause, so we can say where, and we want to compare the Clerk user ID, is that equal to the user.id. All right, so that will tell us if the user is in the database, and it will get the user. So now let's go underneath that, and let's say if user, or if user is in database, then return user. So if logged in user, then we'll return logged in user. And then let's say if not in database, create the new user. All right, so for that, let's say const, and we'll just say new user, and let's set that to await, and then we're going to use our db.user.create. Okay, and that's going to take in a data object, and what we want to add here is Clerk user ID. We're going to set to user.id. So user is the user that we get from Clerk, right? So that's right here, getting it from Clerk, and we want to save that user ID as the Clerk user ID. And then in addition to that, we want the name. Now what you get back from Clerk is going to be, you have a first name and a last name. You could have first name and last name in your database as well, but we just have just a name. So what I'll do is add some backticks, and we'll take the user.firstname, and then just a space, and then we'll get the user.last name. Okay, so that will add the name to the database. Then the image URL. So Clerk also gives us an image URL field. And then email is going to be user. So what we get back here is this user email addresses, because there can be multiple email addresses. So I'm going to get the first one, so it's the 0 index, and then .email address. And that's it. So that should create a new user for us. And then we just want to, down here, return new user. And that should do it. So just to reiterate, we're getting the current user from Clerk. We're getting our database file. We have a function called checkUser, and we're exporting it. We're getting the user. If there's no user, like if we're not logged in, as I am right now, then it's going to return null. Then here, we're checking if the user is in the database, right? Because obviously if we pass this point, there is a user. So we're checking if it's in the database using the where clause. If it is, we're just going to return the user. If not, we're going to create the new user with the fields from Clerk, and then we're going to return the new user. All right, so now what we'll do is go into the header, and the header is loaded on every page, right? It's in the layout. So even though this is just a one-page project, but even if there were multiple pages. So let's bring in checkUser. yeah, so bring in check user from lib/check user. And then all I'm going to do is in the header, I'm going to make this async. Okay, this is technically a server component. It runs on the server. So let's say const user and set that to await check user. So that's going to run it. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and save that. And just to make sure that that's actually running, let's come up here and let's console log user. And we'll save that. And remember, this is a server component, so it's going to show in this console, which you can see right there, null. If I reload there, and it also shows it in my editor. I think that's the Turbo console extension that I'm using that does that. But yeah, so that's null, obviously, because we're not logged in. So let's click sign in, and I'm going to just use Google. I'll use this tech guy info. And what should happen is it'll log me in just like before, but now it's going to get saved to the database. And you can see my console log now is this. So this is the stuff that I get back from Clerk. The ID, updated at image URL, has image, primary email address. So all this stuff you have access to. This is the email addresses object. What else? Phone numbers. So you get a ton of stuff here to work with. Now, for the moment of truth, let's see if it was actually added to the database. So we're going to go back to Neon and user. I'm going to reload the page and make sure I choose expense tracker. And there we go. So we have all the user data. We have the ID. So that's just our database ID, the Clerk user ID, the email, the name, the image URL, created at and updated at. Okay, so anytime a user signs in with either Google or through email, they sign up with email and password, it's going to get added to the database. And that new user file, or check user file, is going to always check to see if the user is logged in or not, and it'll get the user. So I'm just going to get rid of that console log. So yeah, I mean, with the little amount of code that we've written, we have some really cool functionality. Okay, now we're going to basically just show a message with a sign-in button if the user's not logged in. So let's go ahead and log out, sign out. And I'm just going to do this in a very simple way. We're just going to have a component called guest.tsx. And let's just do, we're going to do sfc, and we'll call this guest. And then as far as what we want to return, let's just have a div with the class name of guest. And we'll have an h1, we'll say welcome. We'll have a paragraph, and we'll say please sign in to manage your expenses, or let's say manage your transactions. And then we can just add the sign in button by bringing it in. So sign in button from Clerk, and then we'll just put that right under the paragraph. So sign in button. All right, so now let's go to our home page, because that's where we want to show it. So it's this page.tsx, and let's bring in, say, import guest, and then I'm also going to import the current user. And let's go this home page component, let's make this async, and then we'll say const user, set that to await current user. And then all I'm going to do is, before this return, I'm going to check to see if not user, and if not user, then let's return guest. So a very, very simple way of doing it. And then if there is a user, let's change this expense tracker heading here. Instead of that, let's say welcome, and we should have access to the user's name. So user is coming from Clerk, so we have access to first name. So let's just do that for now. And now we can click either of these buttons to sign in. Just going to hit that and TechGuy info, continue. And there we go. Welcome, Brad. Okay, so that's that. Now, what's the next thing? Now we can start to work on our transaction components. We have everything set up as far as basic authentication, as far as the database goes, and our models and tables. So let's start off with the AddTransaction component, because I want to be able to have a form where we can add our transaction and get that sent to the database. So let's create in components a new file called addTransaction.tsx, and we'll do sfc addTransaction, and then in the return here, let's just add a fragment, and let's do an we'll do an h3 add transaction, and then we're going to have our form. Now our form, we're going to be using server actions. However, I don't want this to go directly to a server action because I want to do some validation. And in order to do that, we're going to have it go to a client action, because you can now have actions on your client as well. And this is going to be a client component. In fact, we have to add to the top use client like that, or not like that, like that. Okay, so what I'm going to do is have the action go to a function called client action like that, and we'll add this so we don't get an error. We'll go right above the return, and let's say const client action, and we'll set that to an arrow function. And for now, let's just do const, console. I'm just going to do a console log, and I should be able to get the form data. Wait a minute, we need to do a couple things here. We need to, first of all, this needs to be async, and then it's going to take in form data, which is going to have a type of form data, uppercase F and D. And then in the console log, let's do form data.get, and we're going to get the text field. And then I'm just going to put a comma, and then we'll do form data.get, and we want to get the amount. Okay, because we can do this now because of these actions, which is really cool. And then we'll call our server action from here, because obviously when we add the transaction, we're going to be using Prisma, and that's obviously back-end stuff. You're not going to do that within the client. But there is some stuff I do want to do in the client. That's why I'm having it go here first. All right, so now in the form, let's have a class of form control, and let's have a label, and this is going to be for the text. So we'll say text. And let's see, I'll have an input, and let's give that an ID of text, a type of text, and also a name of text, because that's how we're getting it here. This form.dataGet is going to look at the name of the input fields, and then we'll have a placeholder as well, and just say enter. We'll just say enter text ... Okay, now let's go under that div and add another form control div, and then we'll have another label. Let's close the sidebar up. So this is going to be for amount, and in the label for amount, we're going to say amount, and then I'm going to put a line break, and then I just want to put in parentheses that negative. So negative is an expense, and positive is income, just to let the user know. And then input, let's do a type of number, and a name of amount, an ID of amount, and a placeholder of enter amount. And then also, if you have a number field, it's not going to allow decimals by default, but you can change that by adding a step of 0.01. 0.01, and then it should be able to have decimals. Okay, so under that last div, let's add a button, give it a class of btn, and we'll just say add transaction. All right, so let's bring this in now to our home page. So app page.tsx. We're going to import add transaction, and we're going to put this right below the H1, add transaction. And there's our component. Okay, we got our text field, we got our amount. We should be able to do like $4.99. Cool. Now if I submit this and I look in, this is on the client. That's right. Remember, we said use client, and you can see right here, SWS, which is the text, and $4.99. So this is a client component. However, we want to submit it to a server action, so let's create that. Let's go to app, add a new folder called actions, and we'll add a new file, and let's call this, what do I want to call this? We'll just call it AddTransactions. And that's going to be a TS file, or AddTransaction, so singular. So AddTransaction.ts. Now with the server action, we're going to put at the top here use server instead of use client. Okay, so this is only going to run on the server. And then we're going to have a function called addTransaction, and it's going to return a promise with a transaction result. So since we're using TypeScript, let's add an interface. So we'll create an interface. I'm going to call this transaction data, and this is going to have text, which is going to be a string, and it's going to have amount, which is going to be a number. All right, then we're going to have another interface called, and if you're not using TypeScript, you don't have to do this, but let's say transaction result, and the result is going to be it's going to have data, and I'm going to put a question mark because it could be an error, but what we are expecting is data, and that will have the type of transaction data. Okay, then we could have an error as well. Again, we want to make that optional, so question mark, and that would be a string. So this function that we're about to create is going to return either the data, which will have the transaction data, or an error, which will be a string. And we're returning the error because we want to be able to show it in the UI if there is an error. So now let's create the function. So we're going to say async function add transaction, and it's going to take in form data. So let's say form data with the type of form data. And then what it's going to return is a promise, and that promise is going to have a type of transaction result. Now I want to get the data from the form data, and I want to do a little bit of error checking or validation, and then send back either the transaction if everything's okay, or the error if there's an error. We're not going to do anything to do with the user yet, or anything to do with the database. I just want to get that part of this working. So let's create a variable. We'll call this, let's say text value, uppercase V, value, and let's set that to form data.get, and then text. Okay, and then we'll do the same for amount. So let's say amount value, and that's going to be form data.get amount. All right, then we're going to, let's say, check for input values. So I'm going to say if not text value, or the text value is equal to nothing, just an empty string, or not amount value. Okay, so if any of those are true, then what we want to return is going to be an error, which will be a string, and we'll say text or amount is missing. Okay, because remember, we can return from this function either error or data. So in this case, we're returning error. And then next thing I'm going to do is ensure that the text is a string. So let's say const text and type that as string. And then we're going to say text value and then dot to string. Okay, so that will ensure text is a string. And then let's do const amount, and we want amount to be number. So let's set that, and we're going to use the parse float function, and then pass in amount value dot to string. Okay, so we'll say parse amount as number. Okay, so we're just formatting it and making sure it's how it's supposed to be before it goes in the database. Now, let's create an object called transaction data, lowercase t, because we want to set that to the type of transaction data, uppercase T. Set that to an object, which is going to be text and amount. All right, and then the last thing I want to do here is just return. So as long as there's no errors, then we're going to return that data, which is going to be our transaction data. So that should satisfy everything as far as the promise that we're returning with the transaction result and so on. Now we want to make sure we export this function. So down at the bottom, I'm going to export it as default AddTransaction. Now let's go back to the AddTransaction component and go into the client action, because that's where we want to call the function we just created. We don't want this console log anymore. What we want to do is create a variable to hold the result of the server action. So we're going to set that to, let's set that to await, because remember it returns a promise. AddTransaction, which we have to import, which it auto imported for us. Sorry about that, Discord. So we're importing AddTransaction, and then we're setting it to the that result variable, and we want to pass in here. Remember, it takes in, if we look right here, it takes in form data. So we're just going to get the form data here and then pass it in like that. Okay, so that will give us a result, and that result is going to be either data or error. Remember, that's the transaction result. It's going to be either data or error. So let's check for the error. So we'll say if the result.error. We could do it like this, or we could just destructure this and say data error, and let's say if error. Either way, it doesn't matter, whatever you want to do. So if error, then let's alert. And I'm not going to keep the alert. We're going to use a toast and make it look better. But just for now, we're going to use an alert. And then else, we'll say alert and just say transaction added, even though it's really not. We haven't done any database stuff yet. But we'll just do that. And then I also want to just console log the data. Okay, so at least we can just try this out so far. I'm just going to reload this. Okay, and let's say like paycheck 400 and add. So we get transaction added. And if we look at the console log, we get text, paycheck, and amount 400. All right, so again, what happened is the form submitted to this client action, but then from there, we called AddTransaction, passed in the form data, got back a promise, and got this data or error. In this case, no error, so it just alerted transaction added, and then console log the data. Okay, if I try to submit this without anything, then I get text or amount is missing, right? And yeah, it's just an alert of the error. So now, before we add it to the database, we need to get our user because we need to add the user ID with the transaction so it knows which user added that transaction. Now, within our actions, to get the logged in user, we're going to import auth from Clerk Next.js server. We're going to do this a little bit different than current user. This was actually suggested to me by the Clerk devs. So down here, let's see, where do we want to do this? Let's just go under all this validation stuff, and let's say check, or let's say get logged in user. And we can actually extract the user ID from that auth. Okay, so user ID from auth. And we can try it out just to make sure, whoops, just to make sure we're actually getting it. Let's say user ID. And this should log down here because this is a server action. So we'll just put whatever. Okay, transaction added, and then down here you can see our user ID. So we want to make sure that that user ID goes into the database when we do our Prisma call. All right, but first we want to check for the user, and if there isn't a user, then we want to return an error. So right under that, let's say check for user, and we'll say if no user ID, then let's return error, because remember we can return an error, which is a string, and we'll say user not found. Okay, and that should do it as far as getting the user. Now we want to, actually before we do the database, why don't we get the toast set up instead of doing these alerts. So I'm going to go to the other tab here in my terminal, and let's npm install react-toastify. And if you've watched any of my other React tutorials, chances are you've seen me use this before. It just gives us nice looking callouts or nice looking toast components instead of having an ugly alert. Now, in order to use this in our layout, we have to output the toast container. So let's go to layout TSX, and at the very top, we're going to import two things. One, we need the toast container from React-Toastify, and we also need the CSS file, which is going to be react-toastify/dist/ and then react, I believe it's, yeah, react-toastify.css. Okay, and then we need to output this toast container down here in our layout output. So we can put it just right above the ending body tag. So toast container, like that. Now, from any component, we should be able to import toast. We want to be in the component, not the server action. So here, let's import, and like that. So import toast from React. React-Toastify. And then let's see, where we want to call this is going to be right here. Instead of alert, let's do toast.error and then pass in that error. And we can just get rid of the alert here. This is ultimately, we're just going to redirect or refresh, but for now we'll just leave that. I just want to make sure if we get an error, there we go, texture amount is missing, so that looks much nicer than the alert. All right, so now the final thing we want to do for this component, this whole part of the application, is save it to the database. So we're going to do that in the server, obviously. So AddTransaction TS. And let's see, we're going to import a couple things here. One is going to be the DB. That's what whenever we want to use the database, we're going to bring in that file. And then we're going to bring in something else called revalidate path, because once we actually submit the transaction, we basically need the the app to refresh, and this is going to do that for us. This revalidate path, it's going to be from next cache. Okay, so now let's go down to where we have this transaction data, and let's see, I'm actually going to change this now to equal, get rid of that. So let's have this equal await and then db.transaction and then .create. And that create is going to take in an object with a data object, and that data object will have the text. So it'll have the text, it'll have the amount, and the user ID. All right, and then actually, you know what, we should put this in a try catch. So let's do this, try catch, and I'm going to move this and the return. I'm just going to cut that and put that into the try. All right, so now we have transaction data. Now in between these two is where I want to call revalidate path, and then just pass in slash. So that way we don't have to refresh the page once it gets added to the database. And then if there's a problem, so in the catch, then we'll simply return, an error, which will be a string, and we'll just say transaction not added. All right, so I think that should do it. So again, it's just getting the form data passed in. We're getting the text and amount, validating it a little bit. We're checking, making sure it's a string and a number, getting the user ID, creating the transaction with the text, amount, user ID, and then we're returning the transaction data. Now let's go to the component, and I'm just going to have a toast, let's say toast.success, and we'll say transaction, transaction added. Okay, so let's try that out, and hopefully it works. If it works, it's going to go into the database. So let's say paycheck 500 add. We get transaction added. We obviously can't see it in the application yet because we haven't added that component, but we will have a list of transactions. But let's go ahead and check the database. So I'm going to reload the page here and choose expense tracker. And we have our user, we know that already, and there's our transaction. It has its own ID, it has the text of paycheck, amount 500, it knows what user added it and created at. Awesome. So that's working as expected. Now one thing I would like to do is clear the form. So we can do that by using useRef. So I'm just going to go up to the very top here and just say import and useRef, which is just a React hook. So that's going to be from React. And then let's go right in the add transaction, and we'll say const. I'll call this formRef. Set that to useRef, and I'm just going to add here for TypeScript HTML form element and null. And then what we can do is we need to attach this form ref to the form. So right here, let's say ref, set that to form ref, and then just right after the success, we can take that form ref and we can say dot current and then dot reset. Okay, so that should clear it. So let's add, let's say dinner, we'll say -50. Let's try a decimal, so we'll say -49.98. Add transaction. Okay, then we're going to just go check it. Reload. Expense tracker, and there it is, dinner, and it has the -49.98, and it has our user. Cool, so our whole add transaction functionality should be complete. So the next thing I'd like to do is show the balance, right? So we'll have a balance component. But this is going to be the flow of the rest of our application, creating the component, creating the action, whether it's an action of, well, we have no more forms that'll be submitted, so it won't be a form action. But for instance, when we get the user balance, we'll have an action that will reach out to the database with Prisma, get that balance, and then send it to the component. So we can close all these tabs up, and we're going to create a new component, and we'll just call it balance.tsx. And in balance, where this is going to be pretty simple, so let's just do sfc and call it balance. And let's see, in the return, we're going to have just a fragment with an h4, and we'll say your balance. And then under that will be an h1, and this is where we want to put the balance. But for now, I'm just going to hard code 500 because I just want to bring it in. So we're going to bring it into page.tsx, the home page. And let's go right under AddTransaction, and we'll import balance. And let's go down here. I'm just going to change the h1 to an h2. And let's put the balance right under the h2 and above AddTransaction. Okay, so there we go. Your balance 500. Now we want to get that balance from the database, and we can do that by using a simple reduce method on the transactions. So let's go into actions, create a new file here called, what do we want to call this? We'll say getUserBalance.ts. And then from here, we want to mark this as use server. And then we want to bring in our database, so import db from libdb. And we're also going to import auth, and that's going to be from Clerk Next.js server. Oops. All right, now let's create a function. So we'll say async function, and I'm going to call this getUserBalance. And then as far as what we're going to get from this, it's going to be a promise, and it'll be an object with the balance, which will be a number, and we can also get an error, which will be a string. All right, whoops, I forgot my quotes. Not my quotes, what is this thing? Colon. Okay, so in the function here, let's get the user ID. Remember, we can get that from auth, so we can destructure and get user ID from auth, and then we'll check for the user. So if not user ID, then let's return an error, and we'll say user not found. All right, and then if there is a user, then we're going to open up a try catch, and in the try catch, I want to first get the transactions of the user. So let's say transactions, set that to await, and we're going to use db.transaction. And then there's a method called find many. Okay, and we can pass in there an object with a where clause. So with where, we want to find where the user ID is equal to user ID. All right, and then let's see, after that, in order to get the balance, what we can do is we can take our transactions that we just fetched from the database, and we can use reduce. Reduce is going to take in a function, and that's going to take in, let's say, sum, so the accumulator, and then transaction. And basically, we just want to take the sum, and we want to add the transaction dot amount. And then we just want to put the starting point, which is 0. So that should actually give us the balance. And then we can return balance. And if something goes wrong, then we'll return an error. and we'll just say, what should we say? Database error, I guess. And then let's export this. So export getUserBalance. And yeah, I think that should do. Oh, we want to export as default. All right, cool. So let's go back into the balance component now, and let's bring this in. So up at the top, we want to import getUserBalance. And then how do we want to do this? So right here, we should be able to say balance. And we need to make this async because this is going to be asynchronous. So await on getUserBalance. All right, and that should give us the balance. And then come down here, and let's get rid of the 500. And let's put in the balance. All right. Undefined string is not assignable to type React node. What did I do wrong here? Oh, this should be, we're destructuring this. Okay, and there we go, 450.02. Now, if we look at what we have as far as transactions, if we go to our database, so we got a paycheck for 500 and we got dinner for $49.98. So 500 minus $49.98 is going to be 450.02. Now, a couple things I want to do before we move on. Where we have the balance, I'm going to use the nullish coalescing operator and put 0 here. So basically what this means is if whatever is on the left is null, then it'll be the value on the right. So if no balance, it'll be 0. And I'd also like to add commas if it's in the thousands. So for instance, if we say, let's say paycheck 2, and we'll say it's for $800, and then we add that, okay, it gets added, but I'd like to have commas in the thousands places. So why don't we create a utility function for that? And you could do this a million different ways, but I'm going to go into the lib folder and create a file called utils.ts where we can just have any little utility functions to do things that we want to do all around the application. So let's just export a function, and we'll call this number with commas, or let's just call it addCommas. addCommas. All right, and then that is going to take in, let's say X, and that's going to be a number, and then it will return string. Okay, and then what I'll do is return the whatever X is dot to string, and then I want to do dot replace, and that takes in a regular expression. Actually, we don't need quotes, we need /. Now the regular expression I'm going to paste in. I basically just use ChatGPT for this, just to get this expression to replace the commas where the thousands place is. So I'm going to paste that in. We want it to be global, so we're going to add a G. And then the second argument is going to be a comma, whatever the character that you want to insert in the thousands places. All right, and then that should do it. So I'm going to save that. And then let's bring that into the component. So import addCommas. And then down here, we have the balance. Let's do addCommas, and we want to wrap the balance and the question marks in the 0. Okay, so now if we check it out, now we have 1,000. We have the comma where it's supposed to be. Now, we're going to move on in a second, but one thing I forgot to show you is if we go to our Clerk dashboard, you're going to see all your users. Okay, so if I go to users, I mean, I only have one, but you can see the user. I mean, if you were taking phone numbers, you'd see that, but we just have the email account, we have the name, we have the user image, the user ID. So you'll be able to check all your users from here. And there's all types of other stuff you can do. You can have, organizations, and you can obviously change up the way that they log in if you want to add different like Facebook, Twitter, and GitHub and other ways of validating. You can do that as well. But yeah, I just wanted to show you that. So now I want to have a spot where it shows the income and expenses, because right now it shows the balance, but I also want it to show how much income we have and how much expenses. So we'll have another component, and we're going to call that, let's call it income. What should we call it? What did I call it? IncomeExpense.tsx. And we'll say SFC, whoops, SFC and income expense. And let's return a div. I'm going to give it a class of inc-exp-container. And then inside that, we'll have a div and an h4 in that div where it says income. And then we'll have a paragraph with the class of money and the class of plus. And let's say for now we'll just put $700. I'm just going to hard code it for now. And then outside of that div, we're going to have another div, and that's where we'll have an h4 with expenses or expense. And let's do a paragraph with money, and then a class of minus. And for that, we'll just say 200. Again, just hard coding it for now. And then let's put it into the home page. So I'm going to bring in import income expense. And where are we going to put this? We're going to go right below the balance. Okay, so if we check it out, that's what it looks like. Now we want to make this real, so we want this to come from our database. So basically what we have to do is find all the positives, add them together to be the income, and then all the negatives and add those together. That will be the expense. So let's create another action, and we'll call this getIncomeExpense.ts or expenses. Or no, we can leave it singular. getIncomeExpense. Now we can probably copy from the getUserBalance action. Probably just copy all this because it's kind of similar, doing a lot of the same stuff. So we'll paste that in. We're setting it use server. We're getting the database, getting the auth. Let's change the name of the function to getIncomeExpense. And for the promise, this is gonna have income. So income, which will be a number, and also expense, which will be a number, and then a possible error. And then here, same thing, we're getting the user ID, we're checking for the user, and then we want to get the transactions just like we did here, but we're going to change some of this stuff up. So let's get rid of that. And what we want to do is first let's get the amounts. So I'm going to say amounts and set that to transactions. Oops. So we're getting transactions, and then we'll use map. And basically we're going to just get just the amount, because remember, transaction is an object that has text, amount, ID, user ID. We just want the amount. That's all we're dealing with. So in the map, let's add a function, and we'll say for each transaction, we just want to return the transaction dot amount. Okay, so that'll give us the amounts. Now, after that, let's get the income. So we can take the amount or amounts, and we can use, let's use filter, and we just want the positive, right? Because the income is going to be positive numbers. So in filter, let's pass in a function, and we'll say for each item, we want to filter where item is greater than 0. Let me put this filter on a separate line. So we'll do dot filter, and then I'm going to use dot reduce and add an accumulator and the item. And then, whoops, forgot my parentheses. So accumulator, item, And then what we can do is take that accumulator and just add the item, because all we're doing here is adding all the incomes together, and we want to start at 0. All right, so that'll give us the income. Then we want to do the expense, so I could just take this, copy it down, change this to expense, and instead of, we want to do filter, but instead of item greater than 0, we want to do item less than 0, because we want the negatives. And then same thing, we're just going to add all those together. So that'll give us the expenses. Now, in the return, instead of balance, we're going to get rid of that. Instead of balance, we're going to have income, and we're going to have expense. However, expense, I want to just wrap it in math.absolute or math.abs, and then expense. Okay, and then if there's an error, we'll just say database error, that's fine. And then for the export, it's going to be getIncomeExpense. So now let's go back to the component, and let's bring in the action. So we want to import income, what is it? Is it getIncomeExpense? And then we can get both the income and expense from that. So let's destructure IncomeExpense from, and we just want to make this a sync, and then await, and getIncomeExpense. Okay, and then we're just going to come down here and replace the hard-coded numbers. This one is going to be for income, and this one is going to be for expense. Save that. There we go. We got 1,300 income and 49.98 expense. And actually, let's take a look here. Let me just reload this. So yeah, we got 800 and 500, which is going to be 1,300, and then 49.98. So that's working. So the workflow is very similar with all this stuff. Now, finally, we want to list each transaction. So let's create a new component. And we're going to have a component called TransactionList and TransactionItem for the individual item. All right, so let's create the list first. So TransactionList.tsx, SFC, transaction list, and let's see, we're gonna how are we gonna do this? Let's just have a fragment, and then we'll have an H3, and we'll say history. Underneath that, we're gonna have an unordered list with the class of list, and basically I want to fetch the transactions, loop through them or map through them, create a list, and then have the individual transaction item component. But for now, we'll just output like a paragraph with the text. So I know we don't have the transactions yet, but we'll create an action to get those. So I'm just going to type out the code. So transactions, and let's say if there's transactions, then we want to map, let's read transactions.map, and let's say for each transaction, now we're going to have a type of transaction, so I will create those in a minute too. And then let's have our arrow, and then open up some parentheses, and for now, like I said, we're just going to have a paragraph with the transaction.text. All right, so that's going to give us an error. Well, it's not, because it's not even in the app yet, but let's bring it in. So I'll go into page TSX, and let's import transaction list, and we're going to put this at the bottom, so right under the form, the add transactions. So transaction list, and now we're going to get an error. Now before we go in and we create our action, let's create the type for transactions. So I'm going to create a folder in the root called types, and let's create a file and call this transaction.ts. Okay, and this is going to be pretty simple. We're just going to export an interface and call this transaction, and it's going to have an ID, string, text, string, amount, number, user ID, string, and created at date. And that's it. So we can close that up, and now let's bring that into, where were we? Into our page.tsx, because, no, not our page.tsx. Where were we? Transaction list, because we're using it right here. So up at the top, let's import transaction, and that's going to be from types. Okay, so we get that. Now we need this. We need our transactions. So we're going to have a new action file called getTransactions. So new file, getTransactions.tsx. So basically, instead of API routes, we're using these server actions, which I personally like. And actually, if you took my Next.js from scratch course, the one I released a couple months ago, we used API routes, but I'm actually refactoring it to use actions instead. And that should be released probably a month or two. So let's say use server. I don't know why I keep saying user server. And let's import the, actually, you know what? Let's just copy one of these. We'll copy the balance. All right, so let's change this to get transactions. And let's see, it's going to return, let's change balance to transactions. And that's going to be, we can bring in the type as well that we just created. So import transaction from types. And this is going to be transaction, but it's going to be an array, so we want to put our brackets, and then also a possible error. And then we're going to get the user, check for the user, and then we're going to call find many. So we're doing the same thing here. We want to get only the user ID's transaction. We don't need this balance, get rid of that. But in addition, I want to order it by date in descending. So what we can do is after the where, we can say order by, and say we want to order by created at, and we want to do descending, right? And then we're just going to return, instead of balance, we're going to return transactions. All right, now I'll make sure we change this too. So get transactions. Now we can bring it into the transaction list. Let's go right here, import get transactions. And we'll go right here, const. So isn't this better than use effects? I personally like this a lot better than doing the whole use effect thing. Let's see. So I'm going to extract the transactions. So transactions in error. And let's set that to await get transactions, which we need to make this asynchronous. Okay, and then, yeah, I mean, that should do it. Let's check for the error, though. So if, we'll say if there's an error, then let's return a paragraph, and we'll give that a class of error, and then just output the error. Okay, so down here, history, we got paycheck 2, dinner, paycheck. So right now, it's only showing a paragraph with the transaction text, but obviously we want that to be its own component. So let's create now, we can close up the get income expenses, we can close up get transactions. I think we have all of our components on the page. We can close up page for now, and income expense, and then let's create a new component. So in components, we're going to have transaction TransactionItem.tsx. All right, and a few things we're going to bring in. So we're going to bring in the type of transaction. So bring that in from types, and then we're also going to bring in the addCommas, and we're also going to bring in toast, because we're going to have a delete button, so I just wanted to show a toast that says it's deleted. And then let's say SFC and transaction item. It's going to have a prop of transaction that's going to get passed in. So let's set that to the type of, and then transaction colon, and then transaction. So we're using our type here. All right, and then in the return, we're going to have list items. So let's say li. Now I want to have a class of minus if it's a negative, if it's an expense, and a class of plus if it's an income, a positive number. So what we can do is add a dynamic class name. So let's set this to curly braces, and we'll use a ternary. So we'll say if transaction.amount, if that is less than 0, okay, so it's negative, then we want a class of minus, else we want a class of plus. And then inside the li, let's have the transaction text. Okay, and then underneath that, we're going to have a span. And in that span, we'll put, let's use our addCommas. So addCommas, and then inside that, I'm just going to pass math abs, so that'll get the absolute number of transaction.amount. And I'm just going to say, we have more stuff to add to this, but I want to just use this for now. So we'll go back to the TransactionList component, and up at the top, let's bring in TransactionItem. And then we'll go down here, and where we have this paragraph, we're going to delete that and put in our transaction item. And since it's in a list, we have to pass in a key. And the key, we're going to set that to transaction.id, and then pass in transaction and transaction. Save that, and there we go. So the reason you see the green for the income and red for the expenses is because of this, the plus and minus class. All right, cool. Now, I'd also like to have the sign, and if it's a positive, it'll say plus. If it's negative, it'll have a minus. So let's go into the function, but up at the very top above the return, and let's create a variable called sign. And we'll just set that to, let's say, transaction.amount. If that's less than 0, then let's show a minus, else let's show a plus. And then down here, right before, let's see, we're going to go right before let's have the number sign here as well. And then before that is where we'll put the sign. So now you can see we have plus 800 and then minus 49.98. Now the last thing I want to do in here is the delete. So we'll have to have the delete functionality, the delete event, and then have an action to actually do the delete from the database. So let's add the button. So under the span, we'll add a button, and we're just going to have an X in the button. And then let's add an onClick, and we'll set that to a function, and we're going to call a function called handle delete transaction. And that's going to take in the transaction ID. All right, and then we're also going to add a class name. So let's go outside of this curly brace here and then add a class name of delete-btn. And we have to create that handle delete transaction. So let's go up above. We'll go right under the sign variable. and let's say handle delete transaction. And we want to make this async. And then this is going to take in transaction ID string. All right, and I do want to have just a confirmation. So let's do const confirmed, and we'll set that to window.confirm. And let's say, are you sure you want to delete this transaction? All right, and then we'll check that confirmed. So if not confirmed, then we'll just return. Okay, and then we're going to await on a function called deleteTransaction, which we haven't created yet, but we will. And then that's going to take in the transaction ID. And then after that, we'll just do a toast.success, and we'll say transaction deleted. All right. So obviously this delete transaction doesn't exist, so we're going to create a new action. So in the actions folder, create a new file called deleteTransaction.ts, and I'm just going to copy the UserBalance action. Whoops. And we'll paste that in here, and let's just change some things. We do want to import the revalidate path, because once we delete, it's not going to update automatically unless we call this. So let's say revalidate path from next cache, and then let's change the function name. So what did I do? Change the function name to delete transaction, and that's going to take in transaction ID. Okay, and the promise that we return, we'll just do a message string and get the ID, check the ID, and then in the try, let's get rid of this stuff. And what we're going to do is just await on db.transaction.delete, pass in an object and add our where, and we want to say where the ID is equal to the transaction ID, and also where the user ID is equal to user ID. All right, then we want to just revalidate path, just slash, and then what we want to return, we'll just return message. Yeah, we'll say message and then transaction deleted. Okay, that's it. Now let's go back into the item component and bring that in. So import delete trans. Oh, I didn't export it, did I? Yeah, we get the wrong thing exported. So export that. Then we want to import that. Okay. Now we're not doing anything with the message that's returned, so we could do const. We could do message and error, and we could do if error. Then I guess we'll just we'll do a toast.error and pass in the error. And then down here, if there's not an error, then we'll just say success. But we can actually pass the message in that comes back from the server. So that would be just message. All right. So let's see, is this going to work? Event handlers cannot be passed to client component props. Did I use client? Oh, yeah, this has to be a client. Use client. All right, cool. So if we come down here, when I hover over it, you see there's a delete button. So I'm going to delete the, let's just add another transaction. I'll just say test, and we'll say 300. Okay, so that gets added. I don't even think we tested that yet, didn't we? To see if that showed up. So it shows up, test. Let's go ahead and click delete. It's going to confirm. Let's click OK. And we get transaction deleted, and it goes away. Now, there's just a couple small things that I wanted to do. One, if you look at the income 1300, there's no comma, so we should use our addCommas there. And two, I want to make sure that there's always 2 decimal places, because there's a chance that we could add something and it just gives us a bunch of decimals, both with this component and the balance component. So we can use the toFixed method and then pass in 2 to make sure that there's always 2 decimal places. So let's take care of let's do the balance first, just make sure it's 2 decimal places. So we'll go into the balance component, and I'm going to add on to balance.toFixed and pass in 2. Now, toFixed will give you a string representation of the number with the decimal points. And that's why we're getting this error, because addCommas takes in a number. So what we want to do is just wrap this in number. So open the parentheses there, and then ending parenthesis here, and that will get rid of that error. And now it should always be 2 decimal places. All right, so the next one is this component, which is the IncomeExpense component. So this right here, and we want to do this in both places where we have income and where we have expense. Now we need to bring in the addCommas. So we'll bring that in, and then let's go to the income, and we're going to do addCommas. Okay, so we're wrapping that. Now this income, we're going to add toFixed to that, and we're going to get the same issue because addCommas needs a number. So we want to also wrap this in number, add our ending parentheses. Okay, and then we're going to do the same thing here. So expense, addCommas, and then number, and then add on to expense dot to fixed, pass in 2, and add our ending parentheses. All right, let's save that, and now you'll see that income now has the comma, and we should always have our 2 decimal places. All right, so that's it. One other thing I just wanted to test out was the email and password sign up. So I'm going to put in support@traversymedia.com, and then a password. Let's see, we'll do continue, and I'm going to have to verify my email, so that's built in as well, which is really cool. I'm just going to pull this off screen and just verify my email real quick. So it just gives me a verification code. I'm going to grab that and paste that in here. Okay, so now I'm logged in as my new account. And of course, I don't see any transactions because I didn't add any with this account. So I'll add, let's say, paycheck 500, and there we go, that gets added. Now I wasn't going to do the deployment, but I think we should, just because it's easy enough with Vercel. There is one thing we need to do since we're using Prisma. So with Vercel, it caches the dependencies of our project until one of those dependencies change, and it does this to allow faster builds. And while this is a good thing, it can cause problems for the Prisma client. So the solution is to just add a post install script. So if we go to package.json, and in scripts, we're just going to add to this and say post install, and then we just want to run Prisma generate. Okay, so we're going to run Prisma generate after deployment, and then that should work. So let's close this stuff up, and then we're going to go to Vercel. Now I already have this on GitHub right here, so just make sure that you deploy to either GitHub or Bitbucket, whatever service you're using. And then I'm going to go to Vercel and click Add New Project. And we're going to choose this project. And then we do have some environment variables that we need to set. So in the .env, let's grab the database URL value. And here we're going to say database underscore URL. Paste that value in. Then we have the publishable key. I'm going to grab that. Put that there. And then the value. Put that there. Add. And then we have the Clerk secret key. All right, so we want the value. Grab that. There we go. So yeah, I think everything looks good. Let's go ahead and click deploy. So this is probably going to take a couple minutes. So I'm just going to pause the video and come back when it's all done. All right, so looks like everything went through. So let's continue to dashboard. And then if we just click on this, it should take us to the live site. There we go. Let's sign in. Now, Clerk is still in development mode, so you can go to the dashboard and switch it to production. But I just want to test out the login and make sure. We should have all the same transactions if we use the same user because we're using the same database. And that's up to you if you want to use the same database in development as you do in production, or if you want to have them separate. But if I choose the tech guy info, there we go. So we have the same exact transactions and everything is there. Let's try to add something new. Say gas minus 50. Okay, so that gets added. Cool. And we'll delete it. Awesome. So now we have a deployed application. So I hope you guys enjoyed this and you learned something from it, and I will see you next time.